Let's just stop and have a look at the industry for a moment, or an industry in general. Now, there's a model out there known as Porter's 5 competitive forces. You can Google it and get more information on that if you like. But basically, this is how it works. We all know that in industry, there's competitive rivalry within an industry between competitors. There's also something called complementers, which, for example, Hewlett-Packard and Intel get together and they create a super company. They've both got products which the other needs and they work well together. They don't really compete against each other. That's what they call a complementer. So we won't worry about that at this stage. We're looking at basically the competitive rivalry. So I'm just going to sit here in the middle, and then how are we going to break that competitive rivalry down? Because there's different parts of an industry that people have different power to influence the way things work in the industry. The first one that we're looking at is looking at bargaining power of suppliers. What sort of power do the suppliers or the makers of the products in the industry have to actually set the prices? I'm going to use the example of the telecommunications industry. Basically, it's a case that, well, if you're watching this on Facebook, you've got a mobile phone and you're aware of the different prices between phone carriers. It's something that's been set in Australia for quite some time now, and it fits in more with the day-to-day use that most people understand. So looking at the bargaining power of suppliers, that's in regards to, can the suppliers actually set the price, which they generally do. Telstra is the most expensive, has the best coverage. That's what they advertise. You pay for that. Looking at Optus, that's the next best. Then you've got Vodafone, who went through a big campaign where they've actually upgraded all of their services to say that basically, yes, in the past they admitted that they had a problem with their services, so they upgraded their towers. Now they're saying, well, if you're missing the call, well, it's probably not because of us anymore. What that's in relation to is their price has now crept up, similar to Optus. But that's something that Vodafone is a huge international telecommunications company. It's actually in you see it advertised a lot in Formula One and places like that because it is such a big company overseas. But it's still struggling, and it's still not as big as Telstra in Australia. Why is that? Well, look at where all the infrastructure come from. So basically, Telstra, being the ex-government company, was privatised, and they've got a lot of the power to basically set the price, but they've also gives them a lot of access to areas where the other guys just, it's not profitable for them to do it. So that's an example where the bargaining power of the suppliers basically sets the price in the market. Now, looking at the bargaining power of the customers, how many mobile phones do you think you would have to have with a carrier before they would start giving you some sort of decent discount? I know people that have got 10 business phones and they basically get, 10% off their bill if they pay it on time. But that's not about keeping their business. That's more about just getting cash flow coming in, and they don't want to default on it. So realistically, the bargaining power of customers, if you walk into a Telstra shop or something like that, and you say, right, I want to get this, I can get this from Optus for $10 a month cheaper, they're going to say, oh, okay, go to Optus. You don't have any power there. What's the threat of new entrants? Well, that's another issue, getting back to the infrastructure, the amount of cost that it does. Basically, new entrants come in the telecommunication market, like, say, Virgin Mobile, but they've got to rent the bandwidth. And there's only a limited number of bandwidth in each telecommunications tower. Most of it is allocated to voice, and then the leftover gets allocated to data. So it's actually hard for another carrier to come in and actually hire it, because obviously Optus is going to want to have the most of their towers for their customers. So the threat of new entrants is something which is basically, it makes it hard for new people to enter the market. Then we look at the threat of substitution of products. Now, how did the telecommunications industry get around it in regards to mobile phones? Well, they signed you up for a 2-year contract and they gave you a free phone. So effectively, you were lined up, you were locked in, and then they would charge you basically a percentage of the phone that was left if you wanted to get out of it. So it could cost you a couple of $100s. Now, most people aren't going to change, and to them, it's not really worth it unless they have some sort of big issue. So the threat of substitution isn't really there. Now, so with mobile phones, basically it's a case that, yes, there is competitive rivalry, but each of the three players have kind of sorted themselves out where if you want the most, you get the best service from Telstra. It's the most expensive. They've also got a lot of cash flow. It's the same with the big banks as well. The big four banks have most of the home loans in Australia, which has got basically why they make a lot of profit and they can afford to do all the other services that they do as well. So why would people not go to the other banks if they could get a cheaper rate? Well, people in Australia get comfortable and they don't tend to move. So they tend to need a reason to move, and they don't really look at options. So it comes into how well they look after their customers and things like that. So sometimes you might think as a consumer that you've got a lot of bargaining power because you've gone in and they've given you a discount. Well, that's more about buyer behaviour and account management than it is actually the industry forces that's going on there. Now, what happens when you leave and you transfer to another one? You start getting calls from them, and all of a sudden they offer you cheaper rates to come back to them because they know that the threat of substitution means that it's hard for you to come back. So they've got to actually offer you something. They want your business still, but it's going to come down to that it's going to be something that, well, they're going to look at the prices and you're going to say, well, I want this, and it's just too much for them. Now, that's a pretty simple analogy that a lot of people understand, but that's something that entrepreneurs, even if they've studied or not, it's something that they naturally do. They understand if they go into a market, are they going to be able to set the price? Do they have a niche product? And that's another thing that Michael Porter gets into in his competitive strategies. He says that basically there's two. You're either providing a cheap product and you're a discount provider, or you're providing a differentiation strategy, which then it comes into the fact that you can charge whatever you want in a lot of cases. So you get to set the price. If it's a case that the customers have bargaining power, they're the sort of industries where there is a lot of competition, there's a lot of new entrants coming in. So there tends to be a lot of crossover in these sort of things here as well. Sometimes though, things don't always appear what they seem. And I use the example of an entrepreneur that I know. His name's Farmer Greggy, and he's been doing a lot of battle in regards to the milk industry and the price of milk. Now, what he tells me is that the price of milk to be sustainable in Australia is $4 a bottle. And when I say a bottle, I mean a 2 litre bottle, because that's the most popular one. Don't believe me, go on and have a look in the fridges at the supermarkets. So when the Coles and Woolworths and Aldi are saying $1 a litre, that's focusing the price on keeping it down. So $2 for 2 litres is what they're saying is, well, that's what the customers want. So they're saying that the customers have the bargaining power. So what they're doing is they're taking the power off the suppliers to set the price and saying, that's all we're going to pay. Now, the industry, there's no threat of new entrants. In actual fact, in the milk industry, we're losing farmers hand over fist, because what's happening is there's oversupply in some places, undersupply in others. But that's something which isn't going to last for much longer, and it's estimated that there's going to be an undersupply in about 5 years' time because the farmers are walking off, they can't make money about it, okay? What's the threat of substitution of products? Well, you've got powdered milk, UHT, those sort of options there as well. But even the supermarkets are saying that Australian consumers want the fresh product. They want fresh, real milk. So they're saying that, well, there's no threat of substitution. But what happens when the supply runs out? Two things are going to happen. You're going to have to take the substituted product like they do in a lot of cases in Europe. Now, we talk about France and their food culture and everything else. UHT milk is standard over there. There's a whole bunch of reasons for it, but basically it's a case that they don't have a fresh milk market like we do in Australia. So what's it going to take to keep it? That's where it's looking at, okay, well, there's not going to be any new entrants coming in, and the big milk companies tend to lock in the prices, and they've done the deals, and they're under the pressure from Coles and Woolworths anyway. So then it comes into, well, the bargaining power of the suppliers to set the price. So they're saying that, okay, the consumers want to pay $2 a bottle. So that's what they're saying. So that's why we set the price at that. But let's just have a look at when this went on. Now, the price of milk, $2 a bottle, is what it was. That's what it was 24 years ago. Now, name another product that is still at the same price that it was 24 years ago. The supermarkets are saying that they're not going to raise the price because the customers want it at $2, and they're talking about the low income earners that can't afford it and they've got costs, and that's the argument they're using. But let's just have a look at the way that supermarkets operate. Now, a few years ago there was a company called Aldi. Maybe you've heard of it. They started up in Australia and they had in-house brands. Now, at the time, Coles in-house brands and Woolworths in-house brands made up about 5% of their sales. When Aldi come in, it proved to the Australian customers that you could get a fairly decent in-house brand, because that's what they all were, but it was a lot cheaper than the name brands and that Coles was selling, and the quality was better than the Coles and Woolworths in-house brand. So what did Coles and Woolworths do? They started to release a You Love Coles brand, or I think was the original one that they did. It's basically the Coles brand, but when you have a look at the price of that Coles brand, in a lot of cases, it's not half price in regards to the rest of the brands that are on the shelf. It's about 25% less. And if you go in and you have a look at the way that the fresh market works in Coles and Woolworths, generally when the meat's going off, they reduce it by about 20%. It's very rare that they'll reduce it by 50%. So if the sustainable price for milk is $4 a bottle and Coles is selling it for $2 a bottle, well, why is that different to the rest of their in-house brand pricing strategy? So this is where it comes into the 4 Ps. It's a case that it's what's known as a loss leader. Now, speaking of losses, we're looking between Coles and Woolworths, and we see in the industry, Woolworths' main income, their mainstay is from their supermarkets. So they're up against Coles, which is owned by Wesfarmers. Wesfarmers also owns Bunnings. Now, people look at Bunnings and they go, it's huge, but yes, it's only 17% of the homewares market. So why wouldn't Woolworths try and get into that market? Well, they did, but it's cost them about $4 billion to close it down. So when you're looking at the price of milk and setting the power of suppliers, it's actually a case that Coles has got a lot more power in that case. If someone's going to move the price of milk, it would actually be Coles. Woolworths can't afford to take the risk that they put their price up and all of a sudden, all of the customers start going to Coles because they're 50 cents cheaper. So this is where the market forces come into it. And sometimes your competitors, it's not a matter of price collusion. It just comes down to that sometimes your competitors are going to move, and why would you charge less for something when you can get the same amount of money for it? Price wars and that in fuel is another one, where it used to be that you see it creep down and you'll see the fuel price go down, and then you'll see the company will pull out. But service stations, when they're independently owned, used to set all their prices and different, and that was a hard industry to get into. Then it come to a case that the fuel price in Australia is actually set not on the cost of production, but generally the price that it costs them to get it from the nearest bulk producer, which is Singapore. So that can affect the fuel price at the bowser in a lot of cases, depending on what price is coming over from there. So again, it's a case that, well, what have we got in industry forces? This is where it comes into that when you're an entrepreneur, you need to understand what is going on in the industry. So different from if you've got a product or you've invented it, maybe you do know a lot about that industry. But what we're talking about here is all of the political sphere of an industry. So it's above the environmental. We hear about a pest analysis, which is your political, economic, social and technological factors. Now there's other expansions on that, but let's just keep it simple for now. So this sits underneath that. So when you're looking at the political influences and the social influences, drilling it down into each industry, this is where entrepreneurs will actually look at the competitive forces. This is part of the decision-making process if they come in. If they see that they've got a product that they can go, right, it's a niche product, people need this product, we can promote this, we can set the price. And what they do is they then go and have a look and see whether or not the customers will accept it. If it works, what happens is other people go, hey, that's a great idea, let's do it. And then there's the threat of substitution. So then that brings back to the competitive rivalry cycle that we've got in here. So I don't know whether that's helped you explaining it, but it kind of looks at, if you're looking at one of the entrepreneurial skills is actually the decision-making process and identifying marketing opportunities. But if you're looking at a criteria for selection, if you're looking at project viability, that's something that we'll get into in the next skill set, which looks at actual project viability. But just for now, if you're an entrepreneur and you're looking at an idea, generally entrepreneurs fix problems. They use products to fix problems, but this is what they need to look at to make it profitable. And when you're an entrepreneur, you're basically taking a gamble that you're going to make money out of it. So that's where they come into it. So at the end of the day, this is what they need to look at when you're an entrepreneur. So when you're talking to Daniel and you're listening to him talk, he's naturally going through all of this in his mind and sort of saying, well, this is what I'm advising my clients to do. Now, a lot of business people that come in, they're technical experts, they start off in a business and they go from there. So if you're looking at what you're going to get out of the entrepreneurial skill set. Yeah, you mightn't see yourself as an entrepreneur, but if you're in business and you're looking at running a profitable business, this is what the sort of stuff that you're going to be looking at, and this is what you can get into.